Hi, my name is Jennifer Kesselheim. I'm a pediatric oncologist here at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute and Boston Children's Hospital in Boston, Massachusetts. And thank you for joining me for the session today. I have no relevant conflicts of interest to disclose. I do want to acknowledge some of our colleagues who have helped to contribute content that you'll see in today's slides. So today will be a talk in two parts, which will be directed at two different areas within Domain 11 for the certifying exam. The Domain 11 is known as Core Knowledge in Scholarly Activities. And in this setting, we'll be talking first about ethics in research, where we'll go over principles of research involving human subjects, principles of consent and assent, and professionalism and misconduct in research. We'll then move on to the second part, which deals with quality improvement, where we'll talk about project design, data, and measurement. So let's think first about this question. How do we know if human subjects research is ethically sound? In order to answer that question, we need to first define what we mean by the term research, which is a systematic investigation, including research development, testing, and evaluation, designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. This definition of research comes from the federal regulations on human subjects research. And if you haven't, you should check out this article written in 2000 in JAMA that outlines the 7 key requirements for ethical human subjects research. And I'm going to go through those requirements now with you. So the first is that the research have social or scientific value, that it have scientific validity, fair subject selection, a favorable risk-benefit ratio, independent review, which refers to the process we know of as our IRB, informed consent, respect for potential and enrolled subjects. So these are the key requirements for ethical human subjects research, and I'm going to delve into each one of them in a little bit more depth now. So first, the research must have social or scientific value. This means that the study must ask an important question. This is valuable for a question that's valuable for improving health or for basic scientific knowledge. Either way, the research is unethical if the research question at its foundation is trivial, or if it's already been answered, for example, and the research is redundant. Next, moving on, with the research must have scientific validity. Even if the question is important, the study is unethical if the methods that are chosen aren't likely to answer that question. So studies that are clearly not feasible, that have and leverage poor outcome measures, studies with inadequate sample sizes, or insufficient statistical analytic plans that don't position us well to answer our question are also considered unethical. We need to know that the data that comes out of this is going to be valid and reliable. So the scientific validity is a key component in the ethical underpinnings of our research. Moving on to the question of who will take part in the research, there needs to be fair subject selection. Historically, risky or non-beneficial research has disproportionately enrolled vulnerable populations, such as individuals who are economically disadvantaged, ethnic minorities, people who have mental disabilities, or perhaps live in an institution of some sort, rather than living in the home environment with family members who could perhaps protect them. Conversely, exclusion of certain groups from research can disenfranchise them from benefits of the knowledge gained. So the fair subject selection means that vulnerable groups must not be overburdened, and there also need to not be privileged populations who get preferential benefits from our research endeavors. 3 categories of vulnerable subjects are very important and considered explicitly in federal regulations overseeing fair subject selection. And this is pregnant women, human fetuses, and neonates. The second category is prisoners, and the third is children. So specific scrutiny is given to research involving any of these populations, and of course, children is where our research endeavors most frequently lie. Next, I want to talk about the concept of the risk-benefit balance. It's essential that in research that is ethical, that the risks are minimized, not that they're eliminated, but that work is done to minimize risk while optimizing the benefits. The benefits of a clinical research endeavor need to justify the risks that are undertaken by the research participant. Sometimes risks clearly outweigh benefits for the participant, as noted here, where the risks seem to be more noticeable or more noteworthy than the benefits to self. This would be the case, for example, in most human healthy volunteer research. And you might argue that those, how is it that we do that kind of research all the time, which of course we do. And the reason why is because also on the benefit side, when it comes to research, we don't just think about the benefits to the subject as an individual, but we also think about benefit to society. What might society gain if the research were to go forward? That kind of goes onto the benefit category of things and can outweigh the risks. The magnitude of the risk of harm should be categorized, and there are set categories that I'm going to discuss in a moment, but the influence that the IRB has and the scrutiny that is given to the informed consent document are all in proportionate basically to the harms that, or the risk of harm that study includes. So many of our studies fall into the minimal risk definition. This means that the probability and magnitude of harm and discomfort anticipated by taking part in the research is not greater than what would ordinarily be encountered in daily life or during the performance of routine physical and psychological examinations or tests. So things like non-invasive imaging, venipuncture, behavioral, neuropsychological, or social surveys, these are considered minimal risk, and sometimes IRBs spend very little time and might even expedite the review of research that just involves these types of interventions. However, there can be research that involves more than minimal risk, but still preserves the prospect of direct benefit to the individual subject. So examples would be clinical trials that involve novel drugs or devices, where the risk can be justified by the anticipated benefit that we hope will be favorable to whatever the alternative is. And in this case, we need to explain to, for example, the IRB, how we will discuss the risks and the potential for benefits in the informed consent discussion. Research involving greater than minimal risk with no prospect of benefit to individual subjects, but which is likely to yield generalization about the subject's disorder or condition, can move forward, but really needs to only represent a minor increase over minimal risk. There's a lot of attention paid to just how much risk such subjects would incur, and to try to keep that into a minor increase over minimal risk. Examples would include for drawing extra tissue samples, extra blood or bone marrow, for example, than what would be allowed under standard practice. So it's increased over minimal risk, but only minimally so. I next want to move on to the topic of informed consent. Informed consent allows us to exhibit respect for individuals' values and their preferences in decision-making about their medical care and their research participation. Informed consent too often is thought of as a one-time event. We sit down, we have a conversation, maybe we sign some forms, that was informed consent. In reality, informed consent is more than just that moment. It's an ongoing process. For every moment that the individual is enrolled in and participating in research, informed consent is ongoing, even if we don't talk about it every day. And valid informed consent includes numerous components. These are the core components of informed consent: voluntariness, freedom from coercion, so the individual can make the decision without fear of harm, that the individual has adequate decision-making capacity, that essential information has been disclosed to the individual to facilitate making a decision, that a distinction has been drawn between what will happen in research as compared to what would happen under more standard non-research conditions. Informed consent means that the individual can understand all that's been shared with him or her, and that person has the ability to actually make a decision when all the information has been shared. I do want to mention, although the JAMA article does not include assent, I included here as a sort of sneak attack, number 5.5, because when we take care of minors, people who are less than 18, we need to think about assent. Human subjects research involving children necessarily requires us to make plans for assent which is how pediatric subjects, those who are less than 18, come to participate in clinical trials. Assent must be elicited if the child is capable of providing assent. So after learning what will happen to the child and why, assent is the child's process of making an affirmative decision to participate in the research. This still requires permission, of course, from one or two parents, depending on the category of research, but the child's participation and their assent is also very important. Assent means that the information that would help the child to understand why he or she is being asked to participate in the research has been shared. There's been a description of what the child will experience from the perspective of the child, and a statement that the child has a choice about whether or not he or she takes part and may withdraw at any time and for any reason. There are circumstances where assent may not be needed. This is the case when a child is not capable of giving assent. And to determine whether a child is or is not capable of giving their assent, you have to think about the age of the child's maturity, the psychological state of the child. There might be medical circumstances that would block the individual from giving assent. Also, assent may not be needed if the treatment at stake in the clinical research is not available outside of the research protocol and has already been determined to be the best available therapy. So if there's already adequate data to show that a particular intervention is undeniably the best available thing for that child, and it can only happen for whatever reason if you're enrolled in the clinical trial, it's not available outside of that setting, then assent may not be needed. And also the IRB may choose under other circumstances to waive requirements around assent. Moving on, I wanted to talk about respect for potential and enrolled subjects. We demonstrate respect for potential and enrolled subjects by making it clear that individuals are permitted to withdraw from research at any time. When we also demonstrate this respect by assuring them that we will protect their privacy and their confidentiality. We inform subjects of newly identified risks or benefits. So if a clinical trial is open and running for 5 years, but in that interim, we learn new information about what risks the child may incur or the benefits, then we share that. And similarly, we share and update subjects about results that might come out of the trial once they're known. And we commit to maintaining the welfare of subjects before, during, and after the clinical trial. Number 7 is the requirement for independent review. This is where the IRB comes in. Independent review is mandated by federal law for most research with human subjects. So we work with our IRBs because federal regulations require that. And IRBs review studies at their very inception. They look over the science, they assess the risks and the benefits and the relationship between the two. They look over the process and the documents related to informed consent. They also monitor studies as the studies move ahead. They do continuing reviews annually. They review adverse events that might get reported. They oversee the reporting of and the mitigation of unexpected problems in the execution of the trials. The IRB also oversees potential conflicts of interest. They know that investigators may be balancing many important priorities and that these priorities may come into conflict. And they serve to protect members of society in this way by making sure that conflict of interest is managed and minimized whenever possible. It is the case that sometimes our studies may be exempt from IRB review. This would be the case for activities that don't meet the definition of research, as I outlined at the very beginning of the talk. This is the case for use of existing data or specimens that are available to the public or data that has no personal identifiers, so just databases that are de-identified. Research, not that we do this much in oncology, but research about taste or food quality and consumer acceptance studies are exempt from IRB review. Research conducted in educational settings involving normal educational practices and observation of public behavior without intervention when the subjects cannot be identified. So these are the situations where there might be exemption from IRB review. There are also other types of systematic investigations which are not research, public health interventions, quality assessments in healthcare settings, resource utilization reviews, evaluation of adverse events. There's a lot of different reasons why research may be considered exempt, but one thing is for sure, which is that the decision about whether a study is exempt is to be determined by the IRB, not by the investigator, him or herself. None of us are able to kind of look at our study and say to ourselves, hey, it's very clearly exempt. I don't need to interact with my IRB. It's for the IRB to tell us that the study is exempt, and that exemption is good for 2 years. If the study goes on longer than that, investigators may need to reapply for exemption. I just want to mention the Belmont report, which was put out in 1978. Actually, its real title is Ethical Principles and Guidelines for the Protection of Human Subjects. The Belmont report is one of the main documents that guide our thinking with regards to ethical research, and it really divides our duties with regards to the ethical conduct of research into 3 categories. The first is respect, which I've alluded to quite a bit already, that individuals should be treated as autonomous agents, and persons with a diminished autonomy are entitled to protection. So we have to really think about respecting the decision-making and optimizing the decision-making of our potential research subjects and protecting those who may not have intact decision-making. The second category of ethical duties is beneficence, where we need to respect the individual's decisions and protect them from harm while maximizing their well-being. So maximizing the good things that will come to these individuals and minimizing the harm. The third is justice. Justice is basically a statement about fairness, that the receipt of benefits of research needs to align well with the people who bear the burden of the research. And that's the main statement of fairness that comes from the Belmont report. So how do we kind of turn these duties into realities when we do human subjects research? When it comes to respect, we demonstrate this through our informed consent and assent processes. When it comes to beneficence, we manifest this when we think carefully about the risk-benefit analyses and when we categorize the risk that may come from the research. And then with regards to justice, this comes about when we think about subject selection and in the protection of vulnerable groups. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about misconduct in scientific research, which is unfortunately something that we have to deal with. It's a reality. And there's actually an Office of Research Integrity within the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services that categorizes research misconduct in several different ways. The first is fabrication, which is listed here, letter A, which is actually making up data or results and recording or reporting them. So basically fictitious or cooking up of research data. The second is falsification, letter B here, which is manipulating research materials, equipment, or processes, or changing or omitting data or results such that the research is not accurately represented in the record. The third here is plagiarism, which is the appropriation of another person's ideas, processes, results, or words without giving appropriate credit. And then the last is kind of a catch-all category of research misconduct that does not include honest error or differences of opinion. So basically, here they're trying to make room for the fact that really any of these things, potentially A through C, could, at least in theory, be the result of honest error, and research misconduct implies that it was not an honest error. This slide is just to point out that there are websites like Deja Vu and others which are meant to suss out and look for plagiarism, and they can actually do linguistic analyses on text to show, for example, that the text is inappropriately duplicative with other publications out there. So there are search engines and technology can be helpful with regards to plagiarism. And this is just an example of 2 abstracts that really have greater than an appropriate amount of overlap that couldn't be due to chance alone. When it comes to research misconduct, you can see here that it is a small bubble here that is situated within a larger population of activities known as questionable research practices. So QRPs is sort of a broader category of activities which are questionable. Only a subset of them are actually fully research misconduct to the extent that we talked about on previous slides, but there are some questionable research practices that maybe fall short of these labels, but are still worthy of consideration. So some examples of this would be ignoring human subjects requirements, not disclosing adequately your financial ties, unauthorized use of confidential information, failing to present data that contradict prior research, overlooking others' use of flawed data, changing your study design or the conduct of results in response to pressure from a funding source. More examples are here: duplicating publications, inappropriate assignment of authorship, withholding details of your methods or results, using inadequate research design, dropping observations or data points because you have some belief that they may be inaccurate, inadequate research record keeping. So this is a interesting, if not disturbing, publication that came from Nature in 2005, asking investigators, some of whom were early careers, some were mid-career, and this column here shows everybody all together, how often they've engaged in various behaviors that would fall into the questionable research category. So this table shows the percentage of scientists who say that they have engaged in the behaviors within the previous 3 years. So as you just go down this list, you can see that the prevalence of these behaviors actually increases as we go down, and that we also see that early career, as noted by these asterisks, early career investigators are potentially more vulnerable to questionable research practices than more senior investigators might be. So perhaps it's related to inadequate mentorship or the pressures of being an early career and trying to establish oneself. You could draw many hypotheses, but the point of this is mostly to show you that these questionable research practices are realities. They're out there, and they're important to recognize as we move forward in our own careers. I want to talk a second about authorship, because this is can get controversial. And the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors recommends that authorship be based on 4 criteria: substantial contributions to the concept or design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of data for the work, as well as drafting the work or revising it critically for important intellectual content, final approval of the version to be published, and agreement to be accountable for all aspects of the work. And importantly, these bullets are separated by and. So eligible authors should exhibit all 4 of these bullets. One other thing to mention here is that this can be helpful in deciding whether someone meets criteria to be an author, meaning if an individual has not done all 4 of these bullet points, then they should not be an author. And the converse is true. Anybody who has been involved to the extent that they meet these criteria really ought to be listed as an author. Next, I want to just talk about conflict of interest, because conflict of interest is an important subcategory within questionable research practice and gets a lot of attention for good reason. And interest is a commitment, goal, or value held by an individual or an institution. Examples of these interests may include getting a project completed, earning an important grant, being promoted, receiving salary support, and it's almost inevitable that 2 or more of these interests could come into conflict for an individual or at the institutional level. And importantly, when we talk about conflict of interest, it's not as important to think about whether the conflict is an actual reality or whether there's just a potential for a conflict or a perception of a conflict. Sometimes potential or perception is what's most important. A conflict of interest may not be inherently bad, but does need to be disclosed so that the scientific product that comes from the research can be critically appraised with that conflict in mind. And conflicts must be, as best as possible, mitigated in order to protect research subjects from undue risk of harm. The NIH and others have adopted rules to limit the impact of investigator conflicts of interest. Investigators must disclose financial interests and those of his or her spouse and dependent children that could be affected by the research, and that's if the financial interest exceeds $10,000. Institutions must vet these disclosures and respond appropriately to mitigate bias and minimize harm before allowing grants to move forward. Take-home point is that the decision about disclosure of a conflict of interest should never be left to the possessor of the conflict of interest, because they're susceptible to self-deception about the influence that the conflict of interest should have on their research behavior. So institutions tend to have external bodies that vet and work to mitigate and minimize the conflicts of interest. A lot of time sometimes goes into trying to determine if an endeavor, a particular academic activity, is best characterized as research or quality improvement. In order to answer that, we really need to know a little bit more about quality improvement itself. This article from NEJM characterizes the patient experience and specifically discusses patient level suffering as being put into one of three categories: disease-related, treatment-related, and system-related. The article argues that system-related suffering is entirely avoidable, and that we should be working to minimize or eliminate suffering that comes from the fact that our care delivery system may be dysfunctional. With this in mind, it's helpful to go through the domains of quality in healthcare. And these were articulated first by the Institute of Medicine in their important publication, Crossing the Quality Chasm. Most quality improvement initiatives that you'll run into in healthcare are focused on one or more of these major domains. The first is safety. Patients ought not to be harmed by the care that we deliver to them, which is really intended to help them. Care should be effective. It should be based on evidence that produces better outcomes than the alternatives. Care should be patient-centered, focusing on the patient experience, the patient needs, the patient's preferences and values. The care should be timely. There should be seamless access to care without delays. Care should be efficient, meaning that it avoids waste. It avoids and minimizes unnecessary procedures or redundancy. And the care should be equitable. It assures fair distribution of resources based on patient needs. When you think about how quality in healthcare can be addressed, frequently we will divide the system into several different domains. The first being the structures of healthcare, the second being the processes of healthcare, the third being, importantly, the culture of healthcare, and that all of these, structure, process, and culture, are important in influencing the outcomes that we experience with regards to quality. And this is true regardless of which of these domains of quality we're talking about. Ultimately, it comes down to these three boxes on the left. The process is what is most frequently addressed in quality improvement endeavors. In fact, sometimes quality improvement endeavors come to be known almost synonymously with the concept of process improvement, which is meant to increase the quality of care. Process improvement is a data-driven system-level discipline designed to achieve appropriate, consistent, and efficient delivery of established clinical measures by changing human performance. Process improvement is essential to reduce cost associated with healthcare delivery, to increase revenue based on high quality experiences and referrals, to enhance the satisfaction of staff. And importantly, with regards to process improvement, Deming famously said, if you can't describe what you're doing as a process, you just don't know what you're doing. Process improvement methods have a systematic approach. They aim for improvement and they rely on the customer or key stakeholders like healthcare providers, or patients, of course, and family members to define the value and to set priorities. Process improvement methods rely on data and use multiple different methods, potentially in combination, to achieve results. When it comes to quality improvement, I found it helpful to use these three terms and to distinguish them from one another: quality assurance, quality improvement, and quality control. Quality assurance is performed before and during production while care is being delivered. It focuses on the processes required to create the deliverable. So these would be things like checklists, for example, that might happen at the moment when care is being delivered to make sure, are we doing our best in this moment? Quality control is adherence to requirements. It's performed after the process is completed retrospectively to figure out if the service was done properly. So this would be, for example, focus groups or surveys that we conduct to find out what the experience of care was in the past. And in the middle is quality improvement, which is systematic, data-guided activities designed to bring out immediate improvements in particular settings. So we're going to drill down on quality improvement a little bit more. When we begin a quality improvement initiative, we tend to begin by analyzing our current state. This is frequently called, cleverly, a current state analysis. That process helps us to understand what areas really need improvement, and we can do a root cause analysis to learn more about why things might be the way that they are. And we can also engage in a process called benchmarking, where we can compare our own process to best practices that are out there and recommended. So these are some of the initial steps to define where we are and what should be our area of focus to improve quality. As we then go about planning a QI project, we want to articulate goals. After we define the problem, the next step is to say, what is our goal to fix the problem? And when we do that, it's recommended to think about SMART goals. SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-based. So the goals we set in a quality improvement project frequently take this form. We know we have a good goal if it checks all of these 5 boxes. There are whole libraries full of improvement science methodologies that have been published and written about and thought through and dissected. I list a few of them here: Lean methodology, Six Sigma, PDSA. I'm not going to go through these in detail. They've even been combined. The Lean Six Sigma methodology is one that seeks its main driving force is to eliminate waste. And they characterize waste into one of these 8 categories in which waste can occur. There are a lot of different methods that are important to know. If you're designing a QI project, it's helpful to think about which model of quality improvement you're most aligned with. But I won't have time to go into that today. Fortunately, we work mostly at institutions with experts in QI methodology who we can lean upon to think through some of these models as we design our projects. Importantly, PDSA is a very helpful model for testing change and improvement. This is the Plan, Do, Study, Act model, where planning involves what do you want to have happen or what are you trying to achieve. Then you do something, so you implement a plan or implement what you have planned. Then you study it if you figure out what happened and why, and then you act on what you learned. In an ideal world, the problem has been fixed and what you've wanted to achieve has become a reality, but frequently there's more work to be done. And so you can go back to the beginning with planning once again and enter the cycle anew. Eventually, after you've tested many times and you've made progress on your SMART goals, we need to move from testing to implementation. Testing is the process of learning what works in our system, but it may not imply a permanent change. And frequently, only a small number of people may be affected by our testing because perhaps we only test on one unit or in one of our ORs or something like that. In implementation, we take what we learn from testing and we roll it out across the landscape of care, making it a permanent part of our whole system and cementing it in as a part of our routine operation. This needs long-term support for sustainability. It has a high success rate if it's done well and if it's based on high quality testing, but sometimes we can hit new resistance when we try to roll something out on a larger scale. So back to my initial question about what is research and how is it different from quality improvement? Now that we know what research is and we know what quality improvement is, we can contrast the two. Research, as we said at the beginning, is a systematic investigation designed to develop or contribute to generalizable knowledge. It involves the testing of hypotheses. It's designed to develop new knowledge, not necessarily to implement new knowledge. Quality improvement is similarly systematic and it's data guided. It's designed to bring about immediate improvements in a particular setting. It focuses on implementation and sustainability. It is not generalizable. The findings are very context specific. This table helps to further distinguish research, measurement for research as compared to measurement for process improvement. The purpose when it comes to research is to discover new knowledge as compared to in quality improvement, where we want to bring new knowledge into the way we practice every day. Research often involves one large blinded test, whereas the tests are more likely to be sequential and not blinded, more observable and transparent in process improvement. For measurement, for the sake of research, we try to control for as many biases as possible. And in QI, we don't try to control for biases. We just try to hold them stable from test to test. In research, we gather as much data as is possible. But in QI, we really just gather enough data from which we can learn so that we can move ahead and if need be, go into our next cycle of PDSA. In research come over a long period of time, whereas in PDSA type of cycles and in QI, we do small tests to yield change quickly and to move iteratively towards improvement over time frames that are smaller. So often, because QI is different than research, it may not require you, when you design a QI project, to seek approval from the IRB. Some examples of projects that may not require going through the IRB would be these: evaluation of characteristics of patients with catheter-associated UTI on a specific service to minimize this complication, implementation of a daily checklist to assess extubation readiness in the ICU, tracking door or procedure or door to drug times to develop ways to better meet accepted standards, reviewing pharmacy records to determine whether a particular med can be changed from IV to oral. Some of these things can actually be done under the heading of QI and may not require IRB review. But despite all of the tables that I've shown, the two categories can become murky and reasonable minds may disagree. So when in doubt, it's important to ask, to speak with the IRB. I do want to mention that your intent to publish your results is not the determining factor in whether or not you need to work with your IRB. Frequently people say, oh, I want to publish this, so I'm going to go to the IRB. Quality improvement projects are often published, and much research, unfortunately, never gets published. So publication isn't really the determining factor. It's whether you're trying to create generalizable knowledge that defines research and distinguishes it from QI. And if you're unclear on that, it's always best to contact someone from your IRB to talk it through. That brings me to the end of the talk. If you have questions, you can feel free to email me at any time. I'd love to hear from you. But I'm also very happy to see you in our office hours that we're going to be setting up virtually to answer questions about the talk or just to meet you. But until then, I want to thank you for your time, your attention, and wish you the best of luck on the boards.